All right, everyone. So thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Brandon Love, and I'm a volunteer with the International Manifesto Group and an activist based out of Ottawa, Canada. Today's panel is entitled Anti-Imperialism and the Western Left. The idea for this panel emerged from the recognition that the Western left has consistently failed to oppose their own government's aggression towards working people of the world. This failure stems from the Western left's inability to understand capitalism's primary logic of accumulation, imperialism. In the imperialist world system, the developed countries in the US-led global north not only extract value from the global south through raw materials and human labor, but also through the underdevelopment and de-development of said countries through structural readjustment, color revolutions, wars, sanctions, and other means. Imperialism and the contradiction between the global north and the global south must be identified as the primary contradiction that will result in the unraveling of all others. And I just want to state that in another way. The defeat of imperialism on the world stage will allow the people of the world to pursue their own independent path free of Western imperialist domination. This does not mean that countries once freed from this imperialist domination will immediately become socialist or democratic or any other utopian notion, but rather the contradiction will no longer be between global north and global south on the world stage, but between proletariat and bourgeoisie on the national stage, without the US violently tipping the scales. However, this event does not intend on dwelling on Marxist terminology or a mere academic understanding of the imperialist world system, but towards a practical one that can help inform the Western left how to respond to today's local and international political struggles. The need for the anti-imperialist left to have ongoing discussions to set out our case openly, compare experiences in different countries, and develop our proposals for dealing with issues confronting today's world is becoming increasingly apparent as anti-imperialists are derided by both liberals and leftists alike. Disparaging terms such as tanky, conspiracy theorist, or useful idiot, coupled with thinly veiled accusations of acting as foreign agents, have become ubiquitous, not only within mainstream liberal discourse, but increasingly within what has now passed as socialist or leftist currents, who take a neither Washington or Beijing stance. Such dismissals are accompanied by openly suppressive tactics, such as deplatforming, refusals to publish or engage with honest or factually sound refutations of propaganda claims, and the circulation of denunciations of fellow socialists reminiscent of the McCarthy era. The left's failure to grasp the central importance of imperialism in today's divisive geopolitical landscape leads to support for wars of aggression, uncritical regurgitation of unfounded or spurious propaganda claims, and support for far-right currents in other countries without the slightest concern for the actual program and policies of these movements, all in the name of a democracy that none of these currents even pretend to respect. This misunderstanding of imperialism also results in the Western left completely misunderstanding the role of anti-imperialist countries, socialist or otherwise. To take one example, China, regardless of the contradictions of its socialist development, has done more to advance the living conditions of poor and working people than any other government in history, but it is dismissed largely as an authoritarian dystopia. Outside of this bubble inhabited by a privileged 1/6 of the world population, most people of the world recognize China as a country in support of an international community with a shared future for humankind, based on common values, UN principles, and the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, as expressed not only in the preamble to their constitution, but in their actual existing foreign policy. China's real threat to the West is that it directly threatens its economic hegemony through its own sovereign economic development and its willingness to support other global South countries to pursue their own independent development paths, largely through their Belt and Road Initiative. However, it must be stated that anti-imperialist politics on their own are not enough. We must avoid and impose unprincipled mistakes, such as tailism, which is the act of reflecting in our own politics the most reactionary views of the working class. This is unprincipled because it undermines the political and revolutionary potential of the working class and assumes they cannot overcome these reactionary views. These reactionary views are instilled to sow disunity and discord within the working class. Not opposing them is tantamount to an act of class collaboration, essentially doing the work of the ruling class for free. Anti-imperialist politics must not be reactionary. They must aim to build the largest possible working class coalition. And today, the conditions are ripe for socialist organizing and agitation, but class struggle rages within the left when it should be waged by the left. That section of the Western left, which is proving unable to understand the role of imperialism in shaping today's conflicts, not only places itself on the verge of historical irrelevance, but becomes a real threat to the advance of socialist and worker struggles. At the same time, a genuinely anti-imperialist left is emerging and growing as more and more activists, sickened by the hypocrisy of their government's propaganda, examine it more and more critically. This new left is not prepared to take at their word the elites who at one and the same time armed Saudi Arabia, vilify and sanction the critics of the Israeli apartheid state, whilst imposing vicious and punitive campaigns of economic sanctions and regime change against the poor people of not only China, but Venezuela, Cuba, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Russia, Iran, indeed any country whose government, for whatever reason, stands up to them. The cause of the most urgent problems facing humanity, notably war, mass poverty, racial and gender oppression, ecological destruction, and pandemics, have to be debated out in the framework of a clear understanding that they are products of imperialism. Their solution has to be debated out in the framework of an equally clear understanding that they cannot be solved without a thoroughgoing defeat of imperialist aspirations and actions. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. It's Ajamu Baraka. He is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace and was the 2016 candidate for vice president on the Green Party ticket. Baraka serves on the executive committee of the U.S. Peace Council and leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition. He is an editor and contributing columnist for the Black Agenda Report and co-founding columnist for Counterpunch. He was recently awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial 2019 Peace Prize and the Serena Shem Award for uncompromised integrity in journalism. So Ajamu, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm really honored to be a part of this very important conversation, a conversation that we have to engage in because of the contradictions that all of the speakers have addressed. And that is the profound divisions among the left, primarily among the Western or Northern left, that can no longer be avoided. We've always had these contradictions, but we've been able to find ways to unite our forces, usually in anti-imperialist struggles. But right beneath the surface has always lingered what a number of the speakers have spoken to directly and used kind of indirectly. That is this division between the realities and the interests of the peoples of the global South. And when I say peoples of the global South, I'm also referring to those peoples of the global South who also find themselves at the center of the empire also. But that contradiction between our interests and the interests, lifestyles, worldviews of the peoples in the North. And it boils down to what Brandon shared with us at the top of this event as the major contradiction that we believe is in play. And that is that contradiction in which Northern revolutionaries, not all, but significant elements in particular over the last few decades, find it almost impossible to accept that the primary contradiction for many of us in the global South, and I say global South because I'm sitting here in Latin America, been here for quite some time, and part of the global South that's in the United States of America, where I organized for 35 years. But that the primary contradiction is between the North and this North-South contradiction, the people of the South. And as someone alluded to earlier, what is so interesting about this contradiction and the kinds of critiques we see coming from Northern revolutionaries when it comes to the attempts on the part of peoples in the global South to transform themselves and their conditions, is that these critical remarks, these critical stands taken by Northern revolutionaries are stances that seem not to have any basis in practice. Because as I think Maria said, where is the evidence that these Northern revolutionaries have an understanding of how you make revolution, in particular in the conditions of the global South? And in fact, when you look at the experiences of revolutionary struggles in North America, for example, the movement that got the closest to developing a pre-revolutionary conditions, in fact, was the Black liberation movement. And we understand, we know what happened to that movement. I'm proud to be here to represent and to have been a part of those struggles. And now 50-something years later, here in 2022, and seeing what we were struggling for then and now, and that is ultimately the end of white world supremacy. That is the issue that we have to deal with, this issue of white supremacy that many of the speakers touched on, alluded to, that we have to really deal with, because it is this element of normalized white supremacy, normalized white supremacist ideology that is really undermining our ability to effect a effective, powerful anti-imperialist stance on the part of the peoples and struggles and organizations in the global north. We can't avoid this any longer. And I'm going to touch on why that's important related to Ukraine. Ukraine has been a lesson for all of us, because what we have seen with Ukraine is this: when it comes to the white left, we know the history of the ascendancy of what became Western Europe, what became the United States of America. We know that at the core of that ascendancy has been systematic violence, colonial violence. That is the core instrument that's been used to create the so-called West, to create the United States of America. We know that even in the contemporary manifestations of those activities over the last few decades, with the new century, the 21st century being the century of the U.S., the progress, the program for a new American century. We know that with the counter-revolution in the Soviet Union, that freed up the U.S. from having any countervailing constraints, but that the U.S. Put front and center again, in direct terms, the use of military force. And we see that beginning, of course, in the 1990s, and we saw that intensifying in the early 2000s. And the result of that has been a tremendous suffering on the part of people of the global South. Even in the last decade or so, with the ascendancy of the first Black president, Barack Hussein Obama, we have the continuation of the wars in Afghanistan, including the surge. We have the war that was begun in Yemen. We have the attack, the NATO-US attack on Libya. We have the intervention into Syria. We had the Venezuela becoming the unusual threat to U.S. policies. So we see that this core instrument of violence, both in terms of direct interventions, but also in terms of subversion and this new weapon that been so effective at using, sanctions, has resulted in real suffering on the part of people. Now, we had some people who understood that. We had some elements of the anti-imperialist movement who understood that, who would join us in our demonstrations, who would engage in political activity, political work with the people and with other elements of the left. But how do we explain this, the weakness of the anti-imperialist and anti-war movement, for example, in the US, in the light of all of the obvious criminal activity? How do we explain that, especially when you then compare the responses we've seen with Ukraine, where basically everyone is up in arms? Elements of the left in the US believe that this is the most horrendous experience ever to face humanity, if you will, if you listen to them. Okay, how do you in fact explain that? Well, it's quite obvious for many of us on this call what that element is that helps to explain that. And that is white supremacy. That is the fact that the sufferings of the Ukrainian people, the brought to the living rooms of people around the country every evening with these morality plays we see coming from CNN and MSNBC, exposing people to the realities of war, something that didn't happen or during the last few decades of war since Vietnam. And the response has been quite understandable. People are horrified by war. But the fact that the left did not, it has not pushed back on how this has been framed, how a Zelensky can talk about the need to protect the West, to talk about so-called Europeanists, to talk about Western values, and that this struggle in Ukraine is a struggle between the West and everyone else. The very fact that that has not been challenged effectively is a reflection that something new is in place, and that is the obvious use of this white supremacist framework, this what I refer to as the White Lives Matter More movement, that has clearly indicated that there's something special and unique and valuable about white lives as it relates to, or in comparison to, the lives of the millions of people who have been snuffed out as a consequence of US imperialist activities. So this is very, very important, in particular because in this understanding, if you will, this message of the value of white life, part of what the state is doing, along with elements of the white left, is to, in order to support the U.S. agenda in the Ukraine, they are undermining and mitigating the threat of something we see as very, very dangerous, and that is the existence of these neo-Nazi and white supremacist ultra-nationalists in Ukraine, that in their efforts to try to generate public support for the Ukraine, they have played down the significance of these elements that for the last 8 years have been organizing themselves, where we know that there have been white supremacists who have traveled to Ukraine to receive ideological and military training. We know the role of the elements like the Azov Battalion. We know that the right wing controlled the streets of Ukraine. We know that the Ukraine became the epicenter, if you will, of the transnational white supremacist movement. Yet, those realities have been whitewashed, if you will, not only by liberals, but by elements of the white left. We find that to be profoundly threatening, because we know that because Clinton says so, Hillary Clinton, that the US is prepared, it has been prepared to utilize Ukraine in ways very similar to how they utilized Afghanistan. They resulted back in the 1980s in the organization of what became Al-Qaeda. Hillary Clinton said that Ukraine had to be could be that same kind of model. And what she was implying there was the possibility of these hardcore white supremacists from around the world going to Ukraine, receiving military experience, arms that are now proliferating every place, and there's no accountability, and the organization of these powerful forces who then will be unleashed against all of us as we go forward. So we see that this is a very dangerous development that few people are reluctant to really take on for themselves, and to take on and to be on historical record in opposition to. So we find this to be a very important element that has to be dealt with. It can no longer be avoided. And so we say very clearly, when we talk about what's happening in Ukraine, we've got to talk about white supremacy, but we got to talk about the impact of Ukraine on non-European workers and non-property owners, not only in the US, where we see that, again, non-European workers are the ones disproportionately impacted by the consequences of this war in terms of higher gas prices and food prices, this inflation, but also what's happening in Latin America, what's happening on the African continent. It was estimated that because of this Ukrainian war, something like 463 million Africans would be negatively impacted by this war in terms of the accessibility to food and fuel. So this attempt on the part of the US to advance its imperial interests in Ukraine, without any regard for the consequences, is having a devastating impact on the entire globe. And this this desperate attempt to try to starve off the inevitable ending of white world supremacy suggests to us that these European powers are prepared to take the entire world down with them in order to maintain their global hegemony. We've got to have more voices.
2-minute warning for you.
We need to have more voices ready, prepared to speak out in opposition to this, and not be afraid of being labeled race traitors or whatever. We can no longer avoid the reality that this issue of white supremacy has to be dealt with if we're going to develop an effective anti-war, anti-imperialist movement. Later for this, these abstractions of world imperialism, we say, for example, in the Black Alliance for Peace, that it's about Western imperialism. It's about the US, EU, NATO axis of domination. We are clear about that, okay? We understand the primary contradiction and the primary enemy. And hopefully we can talk some more about what we need to do strategically to address these issues as we go forward here in this very important conversation. Thank you.